It is 0230 on February 14th, 1951, and the temperature on the ridgeline above Chipyong-ni has fallen to minus 15 degrees Celsius. A gun crew of Battery B, 82nd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion, sits inside the open superstructure of an M16 half-track, 4 Browning M2 heavy machine guns bolted in a powered turret above their heads. Frost has crept along the barrel jackets. One gunner blows into cupped hands between bursts of small arms fire crackling somewhere beyond the tree line. A runner has just reached the vehicle with orders from the regimental command post. G Company's line on the eastern hills is buckling, and the Quad-50 is needed there, now. Engine already turning over. Tracks grinding through frozen mud towards a gap in the perimeter that Chinese infantry are pouring through in the dark. Whistles sound in the hills. Somewhere a bugle answers another bugle. The half-track lurches forward past dug-in riflemen of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, its silhouette briefly lit by a mortar flash, and the gunner swings the turret towards a slope crowded with moving shapes. He does not wait for a fire order. 4 heavy barrels open together, and for the next stretch of chaos, the ridge in front of him disappears behind a wall of tracer fire, moving faster than anyone on that hillside can run. That single vehicle, and 5 others like it scattered around a 2-mile perimeter, belonged to a battle now remembered by historians as one of the turning points of the Korean War. The defence of Chipyong-ni, fought between 13th and 15th February 1951. To understand why an anti-aircraft half-track ended up as an infantry weapon on a Korean hillside, one has to go back 7 weeks to the collapse of the UN front north of the 38th parallel. Chinese forces had entered the war in October 1950, and by January 1951 their offensives had pushed American, South Korean, and other United Nations troops out of Seoul for the second time, back across the Han River in a retreat that shattered whole divisions. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, newly given command of 8th Army, decided the retreat had to stop somewhere, and he chose Chipyong-ni, a crossroads village roughly 65 kilometers east of Seoul, sitting across several roads that fed the entire Han River Valley. If the Chinese took it, Ridgway judged, the whole 8th Army position could unravel. The task of holding it fell to the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Colonel Paul L. Freeman, fresh from mauling 3 Chinese regiments at the Twin Tunnels only days earlier. Freeman's command numbered roughly 4,500 men, of whom fewer than 2,500 were the front-line infantry. 3 understrength battalions of the 23rd Infantry, the attached French battalion of some 1,000 men under Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Monclar, a platoon of the 1st Ranger Company, engineers from the 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion, gunners of the 37th and 503rd Field Artillery Battalions, and Battery B of the 82nd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion, commanded by Captain Clyde Hathaway. Battery B brought 6 M16 half-tracks, each mounting 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns synchronized in a single powered turret, alongside 4 M19 twin 40mm gun carriages. Designed to shred aircraft, these weapons were about to be turned horizontally against massed infantry, a role for which nobody had built them, but for which they were devastatingly effective. A single M16 turret could throw out well over 2,000 rounds a minute when all 4 barrels fired together enough to cut a swathe through an advancing line in the time it took to draw breath. By the afternoon of the 13th of February, Chinese formations from the 39th, 40th and 42nd Armies, elements the intelligence staff estimated at around 25,000 men, had cut both roads into the village, isolating the 23rd Regimental Combat Team some 32 kilometres beyond the nearest friendly line. Freeman's men dug the perimeter tight around the village and the surrounding hills, roughly 2 miles in circumference, wiring gaps with mines and interlocking machine gun fire, and waited. Chinese intelligence had estimated only around 1,000 defenders inside the perimeter. They were wrong by a factor of 4, and that miscalculation would cost them heavily. The regiment had arrived at Chipyong-ni on the 3rd of February, 10 days before the main assault began, which gave Freeman's men time most encircled units never get: time to register mortar fire on every likely approach, to bury anti-personnel mines along the obvious infiltration routes, and to build a communications net linking every company to the artillery. Colonel Russell's 1st Battalion held the 12 o'clock sector of the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kane's 3rd Battalion, the East, and the 2nd Battalion and French Battalion divided the remainder, each unit tied into its neighbours, so that no single company could be isolated and destroyed without the whole line knowing about it within minutes. It was this preparation, as much as any single weapon, that would decide what happened once the shooting started. The first assault came between 2200 and 2300 hours on the 13th of February. Small arms and mortar fire striking the American positions from the northwest, north and southeast, with C Company on the northern line guarding Route 24, hit hardest. Around 2300, Chinese infantry moved down off-hill 397 against E and G companies and were driven back, but shortly before midnight a heavier mortar and artillery barrage struck C Company, followed by the sound defenders would remember for the rest of their lives bugles, whistles and small bells rolling out of the dark hillsides as Chinese infantry came forward in successive waves along nearly the entire perimeter. By 0200 on 14th February, a Chinese platoon closed to within 100 metres of the French battalion's positions before being broken apart by grenades. At 0230 and again at 0400, G Company, holding high ground on the eastern flank under Lieutenant Thomas Heath, came under such pressure that a regimental tank was sent forward to reinforce the line, and it was in this stretch of the night that the Quad-50 from Battery B was pushed into the gap, its 4 barrels turning a contested slope into open killing ground within minutes of arriving. Different parts of the perimeter told very different stories that night. On the eastern line, K Company, under Captain Ed Haynes, took the worst of it. Fighting there grew so fierce that ambulances could not reach the front to evacuate the wounded, and men carried casualties back over open ground under fire because no vehicle could get through. On the southern hills, E and G companies used fugas drums, 50-gallon barrels, half filled with petrol and oil, buried in the slope and detonated by grenade as Chinese soldiers closed on the wire, throwing burning fuel across the attacking line. The French battalion fought its sector with a discipline built from years of colonial warfare, holding fire until attackers were within grenade range, then breaking the assault at close quarters rather than trying to stop it at distance. Battery B's automatic weapons crews, meanwhile, were used exactly as heavy infantry weapons rather than as artillery. Called from point to point along the line as breaches opened, their half-tracks and gun carriages becoming mobile strongpoints that plugged whichever section of the perimeter was closest to collapse. Captain Hathaway's crews would be summoned to critical points along the wire again and again through both nights of the siege, the vehicle's engines never properly cooling, their gunners rotating in shifts to keep firing as barrels glowed and had to be swapped. The contrast between how different units fought that night says a great deal about what held the perimeter together. American riflemen, many of them still adjusting to a war that had turned from open manoeuvre into static defence within weeks, leaned heavily on artillery and mortar support called in almost on top of their own positions, trusting the gunners of the 37th and 503rd Field Artillery Battalions to drop shells within metres of their foxholes rather than yield ground. The French battalion, built around veterans of the Free French forces and colonial regiments, fought with a colder discipline, letting Chinese soldiers close to within 100 metres before opening fire, then counter-attacking immediately rather than settling into a purely defensive crouch. For the Chinese infantry, advancing across frozen paddy fields and up bare hillsides in padded cotton uniforms unsuited to the cold, the tactics that had broken UN lines elsewhere that winter, mass infiltration under cover of darkness, noise discipline replaced by bugles and whistles meant to confuse and demoralise, simply ran into a perimeter with no gaps left to infiltrate through. Where they found a seam, as they briefly did against G Company, they exploited it with real skill. Where they did not, wave after wave of infantry walked into fixed fields of fire from riflemen, artillery, and the roaming Quad-50s, and were cut down in numbers that even Chinese commanders, used to accepting heavy losses for ground gained, found difficult to sustain over 2 full nights. If this deep dive into a forgotten corner of the Korean War is holding your attention, a quick subscribe helps far more than you might think. By dawn on 14th February, Freeman had taken roughly 100 casualties and had himself been wounded in the leg by mortar fragments. He refused evacuation and kept his command post running from a chair. Daylight brought a different kind of danger. Airstrikes and artillery kept the surrounding hills clear of Chinese movement, but ammunition stocks inside the perimeter were falling fast, and the only way to resupply an entirely surrounded regiment was by parachute. Through February 14th, C-119 flying boxcars ran drops over the village, some loads landing inside Chinese-held ground and having to be fought for, others coming down close enough to the perimeter that riflemen dragged crates into their foxholes under fire. The respite did not last. As night fell on 14th February, the bugles and whistles began again, and this time the Chinese concentrated their weight against the 2nd Battalion's sector and against G Company's hill for a second night running. Freeman, judging the breach forming near the 2nd Battalion to be the most dangerous point on the line, dispatched a Ranger platoon, 2 tanks, and one of Battery B's M16 Quad-50s directly into the gap, while gunners of the 503rd Field Artillery lowered their 155mm howitzers to fire directly, almost flat trajectory, into the hilltops the Chinese had already taken, scouring the crest with high explosive at ranges normally reserved for closer weapons. At 03:15 on February 15th, the Chinese finally broke through on the southern sector, forcing defenders out of their positions and opening a hole in the perimeter that it had held for 2 nights. Freeman ordered a dawn counterattack to seal it. The first attempt was thrown back, a second pinned down by Chinese fire from the high ground. It was at this point, with the perimeter genuinely torn open and no reserve left to plug it, that the wider 8th Army machinery Ridgway had built finally arrived. The 9th Corps commander ordered Task Force Crombez, a mixed tank infantry column from the 5th Cavalry Regiment under Colonel Marcel Crombez, to break through to Chipyong-ni whatever the cost. The column left at 15:45 on February 15th, fought through Chinese roadblocks and flanking fire under air and artillery support, and closed on the village. Inside the perimeter, under pressure from repeated counterattacks and napalm strikes from the air, and with Task Force Crombez visible on the approach road, the Chinese abandoned their captured ground at 1400 hours. When Crombez's nearly 20 tanks reached the village at 1725, the siege was effectively over. The surrounding Chinese formations were already withdrawing north into the hills rather than risk a fresh assault against tanks, artillery, and an intact regiment. What became clear in the days that followed was not simply that Chipyong-ni had held, but why it had held. Chinese commanders throughout the war had relied on infiltration, night infantry assault, and sheer weight of numbers to break UN positions that lacked all-round defence or adequate reserves. At Chipyong-ni, they met a regiment dug into a tight, mutually supporting perimeter, backed by artillery that could fire on any point of the ring, resupplied by air when the roads were cut, and reinforced at each breach by heavy automatic weapons never designed for ground combat but devastatingly suited to it. The decision to hold rather than withdraw, which had seemed to some officers close to reckless when Ridgway gave the order, was vindicated by casualty figures alone. American and French losses came to 51 killed, roughly 250 wounded, and 42 missing, while Chinese losses were estimated at around 2,000 killed and a further 3,000 wounded, out of an encircling force numbering perhaps 25,000. General James Van Fleet, who would soon take over 8th Army from Ridgway as its new field commander, later described the stand at Chipyong-ni in terms usually reserved for the finest actions in American military history, singling out the 23rd Infantry and its French comrades for holding completely surrounded in near zero temperatures against repeated assaults by vastly superior numbers until relieved. That judgment was not simple flattery. The battle had been fought at a moment when 8th Army's confidence was at its lowest point of the entire war, weeks after the fall of Seoul and the mauling of X-Corps at Hengsong, just 2 days before Chipyong-ni began. A defeat at the Crossroads village, on top of those losses, might well have forced a far larger withdrawal, perhaps back below the 37th parallel. Instead, Freeman's regiment proved that a Chinese army corps could be stopped cold by a well-sighted, well-supplied perimeter, and that lesson travelled fast up the chain of command. The battle's legacy reached well beyond the tactical result. For an 8th Army that had spent 2 months in retreat, Chipyong-ni was the first clear demonstration that a well-supplied, well-dug-in UN force could stand against a full-strength Chinese offensive, and inflict disproportionate losses rather than simply be overrun. Ridgway used the battle to argue for a shift in doctrine across the whole front, away from linear positions that could be infiltrated and towards tight, artillery-supported perimeters, exactly like the one Freeman had built. The improvised use of anti-aircraft weapons as ground defence, tested at Chipyong-ni, and similar actions that winter, became standard practice for the rest of the war, and Quad-50 half-tracks were thereafter deployed deliberately, not accidentally, wherever a perimeter needed a weapon capable of stopping a human wave assault in the time it took the crew to traverse the turret. Back on the eastern hillside, as grey light comes up over Chipyong-ni on the morning of February 15th, the same M16 half-track sits at an angle in the mud, its barrels still faintly smoking, brass casings banked in drifts around the road wheels. The gun crew have not slept in 2 nights. One man climbs down to stretch cramped legs and looks out at the slope the vehicle had been firing across in the dark, now visible in full daylight for the first time. He does not linger over what he sees there. He climbs back up, checks the water in the barrel jackets, and waits to find out where the vehicle will be needed next. Task Force Crombez's tanks are still an hour away down the shattered road. The siege of Chipyong-ni is not yet finished, but on that one hillside, in the space of a few minutes of concentrated fire in the freezing dark, an infantry assault that could have broken the entire eastern perimeter had already failed, and the men who stopped it were already thinking about the next attack, not the last one.